21-year-old Jessica Runions had no idea that September night would be her last. The man who offered her a ride seemed harmless enough, just another face at the Kansas City party. But Jessica never made it home. Her car was found 2 days later, burned beyond recognition, metal twisted like a scream frozen in time. For 7 agonizing months, her family searched empty fields and chased phantom leads. Then came the discovery that changed everything. In a remote Cass County field, searchers uncovered Jessica's remains. But 50 yards away lay something even more shocking, another body, buried for 10 years. Kara Kopetsky, missing since 2007. 2 young women, different decades, same killer. The investigation revealed a pattern so terrifying that even seasoned detectives struggled to sleep. One man had been hiding in plain sight, collecting victims like trophies. The question wasn't just who, but how many more were there. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The warm evening air of September 8, 2016, carried music and laughter through the Kansas City gathering. Jessica Runions moved through the crowd with easy grace, her smile infectious as friends called her name. At 21, she possessed that particular radiance of youth, the kind that made people believe tomorrow would always be brighter than today. Her dark hair caught the porch light as she laughed at a friend's joke, completely unaware this would be her last moment of pure joy. The party buzzed with the comfortable energy of young people celebrating the end of summer. Jessica checked her phone, scrolling through messages while balancing a drink in her other hand. She'd been looking forward to this night all week, a chance to unwind after long days at work and catch up with friends she hadn't seen since high school. "Jess," a voice cut through the music. She turned to see Kylr Yust approaching, his familiar swagger, unmistakable even in the dim light. At 27, Yust carried himself with a confidence that some found magnetic and others found unsettling. Tonight, Jessica fell into the former category. They'd known each other peripherally through mutual friends, though Jessica remained unaware of the whispered warnings that followed Yust's name in certain circles. To her, he was just another face at parties, someone who seemed interested in getting to know her better. "Want to get out of here?" Yust asked, gesturing toward the door. "I know a better place." Jessica glanced around at her friends, most of whom were deep in conversations or dancing. The night was still young, but something about Yust's suggestion appealed to her sense of adventure. She grabbed her purse, called out a quick goodbye that was lost in the music, and followed him toward the exit. The September air felt cooler outside, carrying the first hint that autumn waited just beyond the horizon. Jessica's heels clicked against the pavement as they walked toward Yust's car. She pulled out her phone to text her roommate, then thought better of it. She'd be home soon enough. The car door slammed shut with a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. As Yust started the engine, Jessica settled into the passenger seat, still riding the high of the evening's energy. She had no way of knowing she was leaving behind the last place where people would see her alive and well. The morning of September 9th arrived with brutal clarity. Jessica's mother stood in the kitchen, coffee growing cold in her hands as she stared at the clock. 7:30 a.m., then 8. Jessica's bed hadn't been slept in, and her phone calls went straight to voicemail. The Runions family had always been close-knit, the kind of household where people checked in with each other regularly. Jessica's absence felt wrong in a way that made her mother's stomach clench with increasing worry. She called Jessica's work, no one had heard from her. She called her closest friends, same response. By 9 a.m., the worry had crystallized into something sharper. Jessica's father emerged from his home office, having spent the morning making his own calls. His usually calm demeanor showed cracks of concern as he watched his wife pace the kitchen. "Did you try her roommate again?" he asked, though he knew the answer. 3 times. "She never came home last night." The words hung in the air like an accusation against hope. Jessica's mother picked up her phone for what felt like the 100th time, scrolling through her daughter's social media for any clue about where she might have gone. The last post was from the previous evening, a selfie at the party with friends, everyone smiling. The timestamp read 8:47 p.m. The normal morning sounds of their neighborhood continued outside, dogs barking, cars starting, life proceeding as if nothing had changed. But inside the Runions' house, time seemed suspended in that terrible space between worry and panic. "We need to call the police," Jessica's father said finally. The words neither of them wanted to speak had been spoken. As Jessica's mother dialed 911, her hands trembled slightly. She'd always imagined police reports were for other families, other daughters who made different choices. The operator's calm, professional voice asked for details that suddenly seemed inadequate to convey the magnitude of their fear. Within an hour, 2 officers stood in their living room, notebooks ready, asking questions that transformed their daughter from a person into a case. When was she last seen? Who was she with? Did she have a history of staying out all night? Any recent problems or conflicts? Each question felt like a small betrayal of Jessica's memory, as if they were already speaking of her in the past tense. The police moved with practiced efficiency, but to the Runions family, everything felt simultaneously urgent and impossibly slow. Detective Sarah Collins from the Kansas City Police Department arrived within hours of the initial report, her calm demeanor providing the first sense that their case was being taken seriously. "We're going to start with Jessica's known associates from last night," Detective Collins explained, settling into their living room with a notepad. "I need you to walk me through everyone she might have been in contact with." Jessica's mother pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts she'd already called that morning. Each name felt like a prayer. Maybe this person would have the answer, the simple explanation that would bring Jessica home safely. The party from the night before became the focal point. Detective Collins took detailed notes as they reconstructed Jessica's evening. Friends were contacted and recontacted. Social media accounts were scoured for photos and posts that might provide clues. By afternoon, a name began to surface repeatedly in witness statements. Kylr Yust. Several people remembered seeing Jessica leave with him, though accounts differed on the exact timing. Some described their departure as casual, others noticed something that seemed rushed. Detective Collins ran Yust's name through the system and found a history that made her jaw tighten. Domestic violence arrests, restraining orders, a pattern of volatile relationships marked by control and intimidation. Most disturbing of all was an active missing person case from 2007. Kara Kopetsky, a 17-year-old who had vanished after ending a relationship with Yust. "We need to find him," Collins told her partner as they prepared to leave the Runions' home. "And we need to find him today." The afternoon stretched into evening with search efforts expanding across the city. Flyers with Jessica's smiling face appeared on telephone poles and storefront windows. Her photograph, taken just months earlier, showed a young woman full of life and possibility, a stark contrast to the growing fear that now surrounded her disappearance. Jessica's parents coordinated with police while fielding calls from friends and extended family. Their house filled with neighbors bringing food and offering support, the kind of mobilization that happens when a community realizes one of their own is in danger. As darkness fell on September 9th, search teams prepared for a long night ahead. Somewhere in Kansas City, a young woman was missing, and time was becoming the enemy of hope. September 10th dawned gray and overcast, matching the mood that had settled over the search efforts. Detective Collins received the call at 6:47 a.m. A burned vehicle had been discovered south of Kansas City, and the license plate matched Jessica Runions' Chevrolet Equinox. The scene was devastating in its finality. What remained of Jessica's car sat in a rural area, metal twisted and blackened beyond recognition. The fire had been so intense that identifying the vehicle required checking the VIN number against Jessica's registration records. Everything inside had been completely destroyed. Crime scene technicians worked methodically around the wreckage, photographing every angle and collecting what little evidence survived the flames. The location was isolated, the kind of place someone would choose if they wanted to destroy evidence without being observed. Detective Collins stood beside the burned shell of the car, feeling the weight of what this discovery meant for the Runions family. She'd handled missing person cases that ended in tragedy before, but something about Jessica's youth and the deliberate nature of this destruction felt particularly cruel. Her phone buzzed with updates from the investigation team. Yust's whereabouts on September 8th and 9th were being traced through cell phone records and witness interviews. He had an alibi that was shaky at best, claims of being with friends who couldn't quite remember the timeline clearly. The drive back to inform Jessica's parents was the worst part of Detective Collins' job. She'd done it dozens of times, but breaking a family's hope never got easier. The Runions deserved to know about the car, even though it raised more questions than it answered. When she arrived at their home, the family gathered in the living room that had become their command center. Maps covered the coffee table, phones charged on every surface, and Jessica's high school graduation photo watched over everything from the mantelpiece. "We found Jessica's car," Detective Collins began, and watched as the last fragments of routine hope died in their eyes. The news spread quickly through their neighborhood and beyond. Local media picked up the story, transforming Jessica from a missing person into a presumed victim. Her case joined the grim statistics of young women who vanished under suspicious circumstances, their stories told in newspaper headlines and evening news broadcasts. That evening, The first candlelight vigil was held in Jessica's honor, drawing hundreds of people who had never met her but felt compelled to stand together against the darkness that had touched their community. The days following the discovery of Jessica's burned car brought an intensity to the investigation that the Runions family found both comforting and overwhelming. Detective Collins briefed them regularly, explaining how the case was expanding beyond Kansas City's jurisdiction as evidence pointed to multiple locations. Media attention escalated quickly. Jessica's story resonated with viewers who saw their own daughters in her smiling photographs. The local news stations ran features about the investigation, and Jessica's parents found themselves thrust into the unfamiliar role of public advocates for their missing daughter. Kylr Yust became the focus of increasingly aggressive questioning. His past with Kara Kopetsky, the teenager who had vanished in 2007, created a disturbing pattern that investigators couldn't ignore. Two young women, both linked to the same man, both disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The community responded with a mixture of fear and solidarity. Parents held their children closer, while volunteers organized search parties that combed through fields and wooded areas around Kansas City. Jessica's disappearance had awakened a primal fear. If this could happen to someone like her, it could happen to anyone. Yust maintained his innocence during police interviews, but his story contained inconsistencies that investigators noted carefully. His lawyers advised him to stop cooperating with police, a decision that frustrated the Runions family and further inflamed public suspicion. Jessica's mother threw herself into the search with desperate energy. She coordinated with volunteer groups, spoke to media outlets, and maintained a constant presence on social media, sharing Jessica's photo and asking for information. Sleep became secondary to the mission of bringing her daughter home. The burned car yielded few forensic clues. The fire had been too complete, destroying DNA evidence, fingerprints, and any personal items that might have provided leads. What remained was circumstantial. Jessica had been seen leaving with Yust, her car was found burned, and Yust's history suggested a capacity for violence. Neighbors began to look at each other differently. The realization that someone among them might be capable of such violence created an undercurrent of suspicion that affected casual conversations and community gatherings. Trust, once freely given, became a more precious commodity. As September turned to October, the investigation settled into the grinding routine of police work following leads that went nowhere, re-interviewing witnesses whose memories grew hazier with time, and waiting for the breakthrough that might never come. October and November passed in a blur of false leads and frustrated hope. Detective Collins and her team pursued every tip, no matter how remote. Phone records were analyzed, security, camera footage was reviewed, and known associates were interviewed and re-interviewed. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing additional resources and expertise to what had clearly become a complex multi-jurisdictional case. Special Agent Martinez worked closely with local law enforcement, coordinating efforts across state lines as the investigation expanded. Jessica's parents established a routine that helped them cope with the terrible uncertainty. Her mother continued organizing search parties every weekend, while her father worked with police on the technical aspects of the investigation. Their marriage, tested by grief and stress, found strength in their shared determination to find answers. The media attention began to fade as other stories captured public interest. This was perhaps the most difficult aspect for Jessica's family, watching their daughter's case slip from front-page news to occasional updates buried in the back sections of newspapers. Yust's legal team had successfully limited his cooperation with investigators. Without new evidence or witnesses, the case began to feel like it was stalling. Detective Collins met regularly with prosecutors to discuss their options, but everyone knew they needed more than circumstantial evidence to move forward. The first snow of winter fell in early December, adding a layer of melancholy to the search efforts. Volunteers were fewer now, and the searches had to be called off during the worst weather. Jessica's room at home remained exactly as she'd left it, a shrine to interrupted life that her parents couldn't bear to disturb. Phone records and financial statements were analyzed repeatedly, looking for patterns that might reveal Jessica's final hours. Yust's movements on September 8th and 9th had been partially reconstructed, but crucial gaps remained in the timeline windows of time when his whereabouts couldn't be verified. The investigation team grew smaller as other cases demanded attention, but Detective Collins refused to let Jessica's case go cold. She reviewed the files daily, looking for connections or evidence that might have been overlooked in the initial urgency of the search. Community support remained strong despite the media's waning attention. Local businesses displayed Jessica's photo, and missing person flyers remained posted throughout Kansas City. The neighborhood had been changed by her disappearance, bound together by shared tragedy and determination. December brought a different kind of pain to the Runions family. The holidays, which had always been times of joy and connection, now served as stark reminders of Jessica's absence. Her empty chair at Christmas dinner felt like a physical weight in the room. The family decided to hold a Christmas vigil for Jessica, inviting the community to join them in prayer and remembrance. Despite the cold weather and falling snow, hundreds of people gathered in the local park, holding candles and sharing memories of Jessica's vibrant spirit. Detective Collins attended the vigil, standing at the back of the crowd and watching the faces illuminated by candlelight. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They kept Jessica's case in the public consciousness while providing emotional support for her family, but they also sometimes attracted people with information who hadn't previously come forward. Jessica's mother spoke to the gathering, her voice clear, despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her words. "Jessica would want us to keep believing," she said. "She would want us to keep fighting for the truth, no matter how long it takes." The investigation continued during the holiday break, though at a reduced pace. Phone tips still came in regularly, most of them well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful. People reported seeing Jessica in distant cities, or claimed to have information about Yust's activities, but none of these leads produced substantive evidence. Yust himself had become increasingly isolated as his connection to Jessica's disappearance became public knowledge. Former friends distanced themselves, and he found it difficult to maintain employment or stable relationships. This isolation made him harder to monitor, but also limited his ability to influence potential witnesses. The forensic analysis of Jessica's burned car was completed, but the results were disappointing. The fire had been too thorough, leaving little evidence that could definitively link Yust to the vehicle's destruction. Investigators had hoped to find trace evidence, fibers, hair, fingerprints that would provide the smoking gun they needed. As 2016 drew to a close, Jessica's case remained officially active but practically stalled. Her parents faced the new year with a mixture of determination and despair, knowing that each passing day made it less likely their daughter would be found alive. The community's response to their tragedy had been overwhelming, but they also understood that public attention was finite. Soon, they would be largely alone with their grief and their questions. The new year of 2017 brought renewed energy to Jessica's case, partly due to her family's refusal to let the investigation fade into bureaucratic routine. Jessica's mother had become an effective advocate, working with missing person organizations and learning to navigate the complex relationships between local police, federal investigators, and prosecutors' offices. Detective Collins used the fresh calendar year as an opportunity to reassess the case from the beginning. She spread Jessica's file across her desk: photographs, witness statements, phone records, forensic reports, and tried to see patterns that might have been missed in the initial intensity of the investigation. New tips continued to come in, many triggered by anniversary coverage of Jessica's disappearance. Some callers claimed to have seen suspicious activity in rural areas around Kansas City. Others provided information about Yust's behavior in the months following Jessica's disappearance. The investigation team decided to expand their search area, focusing on locations where someone might dispose of evidence or remains. This meant coordinating with multiple law enforcement agencies and organizing search parties that could cover vast stretches of rural Missouri terrain. Jessica's father took on the role of liaison with volunteer search groups, his methodical nature helping to organize efforts that might otherwise have been chaotic. He studied maps, coordinated with landowners for permission to search private property, and maintained detailed records of areas that had been covered. The media attention around Jessica's case had an unexpected side effect. It brought renewed attention to Kara Kopetsky's disappearance from 2007. Families of other missing women began reaching out to the Runions, creating an informal network of people united by tragedy and determination. Prosecutors continued to review the evidence against Yust, looking for ways to build a case that could withstand the scrutiny of trial. The circumstantial nature of the evidence was problematic, but not insurmountable if more pieces could be added to the puzzle. February brought the worst blizzard in recent memory, effectively halting search efforts for nearly 2 weeks. The weather seemed to conspire against their efforts, adding another layer of frustration to an already difficult situation. Despite the setbacks, Jessica's parents maintained their weekly vigils and continued their media appearances. They had learned that keeping Jessica's story in the public consciousness was crucial to generating new leads and maintaining pressure on investigators. March 2017 arrived with the promise of spring and a breakthrough that would change everything. A group of volunteer searchers working in rural Cass County made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the investigation. Human remains, partially buried and weathered by months of exposure, were found in an isolated field about 40 miles south of Kansas City. Detective Collins received the call at 3:17 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. The remains appeared to be those of a young woman found in an area that had been searched before, but not with the methodical care that the volunteer group had applied. Initial observations suggested the remains had been in place for several months. The forensic team arrived within hours, cordoning off a large area around the discovery site. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the county's chief medical examiner, supervised the careful excavation of the remains and the surrounding soil. Every fragment was preserved and cataloged for analysis. The call to Jessica's parents was delayed until preliminary identification could be attempted. Detective Collins wanted to be as certain as possible before subjecting the family to what might be another false hope. Dental records were requested and compared with the skeletal remains. By evening, the match was confirmed. The remains found in Cass County were those of Jessica Runions. The young woman who had vanished 6 months earlier had finally been found, but not in the way her family had prayed for. The news broke on local television that night, ending months of uncertainty with the cruelest possible answer. Jessica's parents received the notification in person from Detective Collins, who sat with them as they processed the reality that their daughter was never coming home. The discovery site became a focal point for renewed forensic investigation. The field where Jessica's remains were found was treated as an active crime scene, with investigators looking for any evidence that might have been preserved alongside her body. What they found nearby changed the trajectory of the case entirely. A second set of remains was discovered approximately 50 yards from Jessica's body, these showing signs of having been in place much longer. Initial analysis suggested these remains might belong to another young woman, someone who had been missing for years rather than months. The possibility that Jessica's case was connected to other disappearances gave the investigation a new urgency and complexity. Two families were about to learn that their worst fears had been realized. The identification of the second set of remains took longer, but the outcome was equally devastating. Dental records confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect: the bones belonged to Kara Kopetsky, the 17-year-old who had vanished in 2007. Kara's mother, who had spent nearly a decade searching for her daughter, received the news with a mixture of grief and relief. The uncertainty that had defined her life for 10 years was finally over, though the answers came at a price she had never wanted to pay. The discovery of both bodies in the same isolated area was more than coincidental. It established a clear pattern and provided investigators with the strongest evidence yet of Yust's involvement in both disappearances. The geographical connection between the cases created a narrative that prosecutors could present to a jury. Dr. Hendricks worked carefully to extract whatever forensic evidence the remains might provide. The condition of Jessica's body, having been exposed to the elements for 6 months, limited the analysis that could be performed. Kara's remains, after 10 years, offered even fewer clues about the circumstances of her death. Still, the forensic team was able to determine that both women had died violently. The positioning of the remains and evidence of trauma to the bones suggested neither death had been accidental or from natural causes. The media response was immediate and intense. The discovery of both bodies created a sensation that reached beyond Kansas City, drawing national attention to what had become a serial case. Jessica and Kara's photographs appeared side by side on news broadcasts, two young women whose lives had been cut short by the same predator. Yust's legal situation changed dramatically with the discovery of the remains. What had been a missing person case was now a double homicide investigation, and prosecutors began preparing their strategy for bringing formal charges. The community response was equally intense. The knowledge that two young women had been murdered and their bodies hidden in a field outside the city created a fear that seemed to touch every family. Parents questioned whether their children were safe, and longtime residents wondered how such violence had remained hidden for so long. Jessica's parents found themselves navigating grief while also serving as advocates for both their daughter and Kara. The families had been brought together by tragedy, united in their determination to see justice served. The weeks following the discovery of both bodies brought a flurry of investigative activity. Detective Collins coordinated with multiple agencies as the case expanded to encompass 2 homicides spanning a decade. The FBI's involvement intensified, with federal investigators bringing additional resources to what had clearly become a complex serial case. Kara Kopetsky's disappearance in 2007 was re-examined with fresh eyes and new forensic techniques. Evidence that had been collected at the time was retested using advances in DNA analysis and trace evidence processing that hadn't been available 10 years earlier. The connection between Jessica and Kara through Yust created a timeline of violence that prosecutors found compelling. Kara had been trying to end her relationship with Yust when she vanished. Jessica's brief encounter with him appeared to have triggered a similar violent response. Media coverage intensified as reporters delved into Yust's background and history of volatile relationships. Former girlfriends came forward with stories of abuse, control, and threatening behavior that painted a picture of escalating violence over many years. The public's fascination with the case created both opportunities and challenges for investigators. Tips poured in from people who claimed to have information about Yust's activities during the relevant time periods. Most of these tips proved irrelevant, but some provided useful background information about his behavior and association. Jessica's parents struggled with the transition from hoping for their daughter's safe return to seeking justice for her murder. The discovery of her body had ended the uncertainty, but it had also transformed their grief into something sharper and more focused. Community vigils took on a different character now that the search for Jessica was over. The gatherings became memorials for both young women, with speakers calling for justice and action to prevent similar tragedies. The local government promised increased funding for domestic violence prevention programs and improved training for law enforcement officers. Yust's legal team prepared for what they knew would be an aggressive prosecution. The circumstantial evidence was substantial, and the discovery of both bodies in the same location would be difficult to explain away. They began developing a defense strategy based on challenging the forensic evidence and questioning the reliability of witnesses whose memories spanned many years. The case that had begun with a missing person report was evolving into one of the most significant criminal prosecutions in Kansas City's recent history. By fall 2017, prosecutors felt confident they had sufficient evidence to proceed with formal charges against Kylr Yust. The grand jury proceedings were conducted in secrecy, but the outcome was announced with considerable fanfare. Yust was indicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Jessica Runions and Kara Kopetsky. The arrest took place on a gray October morning, with media crews positioned outside the courthouse as Yust was led inside in handcuffs. The sight of him in custody provided both families with their first tangible sense that justice might finally be served. Detective Collins had worked on the case for over a year, and seeing Yust charged with both murders represented a personal and professional victory. The investigation had tested her skills and dedication, but the evidence they had assembled told a compelling story of premeditated violence. The legal process that followed would be lengthy and complex. Murder trials often take years to reach completion, especially in cases involving multiple victims and extensive forensic evidence. Both families prepared themselves for a long journey through the criminal justice system. Jessica's parents found that the arrest brought both relief and renewed anxiety. They were gratified that the case was moving forward, but they also understood that a trial would mean reliving the worst moments of their daughter's disappearance and death in a public forum. Kara's mother, who had waited 10 years for this moment, felt a complex mixture of vindication and sorrow. The arrest validated her belief that her daughter had been murdered, but it also confirmed that Kara had died violently at the hands of someone she had once trusted. Public reaction to the arrest was overwhelmingly positive, with many community members expressing relief that the suspected killer was finally in custody. The case had created an atmosphere of fear that affected how parents supervised their children and how young women navigated social situations. Yust's legal team immediately began challenging the evidence and questioning the validity of the charges. They argued that the prosecution's case was based on coincidence and speculation rather than concrete proof of their client's guilt. The media coverage of the arrest was extensive, with reporters rehashing the details of both disappearances and examining the evidence that had led to the indictment. Jessica and Kara's stories were told and retold, ensuring that their memories remained in the public consciousness. The period between Yust's arrest and the beginning of his trial stretched across 3 years, from 2017 to 2021. This extended timeline was typical for complex murder cases, but it represented an agonizing wait for both families who wanted to see justice served. Legal motions dominated the pre-trial period, with defense attorneys challenging various aspects of the prosecution's evidence. They questioned the validity of the forensic analysis, the reliability of witness testimony, and the circumstances under which evidence had been collected. Detective Collins used this time to strengthen the case wherever possible. She re-interviewed witnesses, coordinated with forensic experts to ensure their testimony would be compelling, and worked with prosecutors to anticipate the defense's strategy. The families remained active during this period, speaking at conferences about missing persons cases and advocating for legislative changes that might prevent similar tragedies. Their loss had given them a platform to push for reforms in how law enforcement handles domestic violence and missing person cases. Jessica's room at home remained unchanged, a painful shrine that her parents couldn't bring themselves to alter. Photographs, awards from school, and personal items served as reminders of the life that had been cut short. Her mother often sat there in the evenings, finding both comfort and sorrow in the preserved space. Kara's mother had long since transformed her grief into activism, working with other families of missing persons to improve search techniques and support systems. The discovery of Kara's body had provided closure, but it had also intensified her commitment to helping others in similar situations. The community's attention gradually shifted to other concerns, though Jessica and Kara's cases remained important to many residents. Annual memorial services kept their memories alive while also raising funds for organizations that supported families of missing persons. Yust remained in custody throughout this period, held without bail due to the severity of the charges against him. His legal team continued to file motions and challenge the prosecution's evidence, but the fundamental facts of the case remained unchanged. Media coverage during the pretrial period was sporadic, focusing mainly on significant legal developments and the anniversary dates of the disappearances. Both families learned to manage their public roles while protecting their private grief from constant scrutiny. The year 2020 brought an unexpected complication to the legal proceedings: the COVID-19 pandemic. Court schedules were disrupted as the judicial system adapted to health safety protocols, causing further delays in what had already been a prolonged process. Jessica's parents found the additional waiting particularly difficult. They had prepared themselves emotionally for a trial that kept being postponed due to circumstances beyond anyone's control. The uncertainty of when justice would finally be served added another layer of stress to their already difficult situation. Virtual court hearings became common for routine motions, but both sides agreed that the actual trial needed to be conducted in person. The gravity of the charges and the complexity of the evidence required the full attention and engagement that only face-to-face proceedings could provide. During this period, both families used their platform to speak out about the broader issues raised by their daughters' cases. They testified before state legislators about domestic violence prevention and supported initiatives to improve law enforcement training in missing person investigation. The prosecution team used the extended timeline to further refine their case. They consulted with additional forensic experts, reviewed all witness testimony for consistency, and prepared detailed visual presentations that would help a jury understand the complex evidence. Defense attorneys similarly prepared for trial, developing their strategy around creating reasonable doubt about Yust's involvement in both murders. They planned to argue that the evidence was circumstantial and that other suspects had not been adequately investigated. The community's anticipation for the trial remained high despite the delays. Many residents had followed the case since Jessica's initial disappearance and felt personally invested in the outcome. Local media outlets prepared extensive coverage plans for when the trial finally began. Yust's time in custody had been difficult, with other inmates aware of his charges and the community attention surrounding his case. His legal team argued that pre-trial publicity had made it impossible for him to receive a fair trial in the Kansas City area, but judges rejected their requests for a change of venue. As 2020 ended and 2021 began, all parties prepared for what everyone expected would be an emotionally charged and closely watched trial. The families steeled themselves for the painful process of reliving their loss in pursuit of justice. April 2021 finally brought the beginning of the trial that both families had awaited for nearly 4 years. The Jackson County Courthouse was packed with media representatives, family members, and curious community members who wanted to witness the conclusion of one of Kansas City's most notorious cases. Jury selection took several days, with both sides carefully questioning potential jurors about their knowledge of the case and their ability to remain impartial despite extensive media coverage. The selected jury included people from various backgrounds, but all had expressed confidence in their ability to focus on the evidence presented in court. Judge Charles Atwell presided over the proceedings with the gravity that such a significant case demanded. He had handled multiple high-profile trials during his career, but the emotional weight of this double murder case was evident in his careful management of courtroom procedures. The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chen, laid out a clear narrative of violence spanning more than a decade. She described Yust as a man whose inability to control his relationships had led to the murders of 2 innocent young women. Jessica Runions and Kara Kopetsky died because they had the misfortune of crossing paths with the defendant, Chen told the jury. The evidence will show that killer Yust is responsible for both of these senseless murders, and that he tried to cover up his crimes by hiding their bodies in a remote field. The defense's opening statement, delivered by attorney Michael Torres, focused on the lack of direct evidence linking Yust to either murder. He acknowledged the tragedy of both deaths, but argued that the prosecution's case was built on speculation and coincidence rather than proof. Jessica's parents sat in the front row of the courtroom, holding hands as they listened to their daughter's final hours being dissected for legal purposes. The formal language of the legal system seemed inadequate to capture the magnitude of their loss. Kara's mother sat nearby, having waited 14 years for this moment. The trial represented not just the possibility of justice for her daughter, but validation that her years of advocacy and searching had been worthwhile. The media coverage was extensive, with reporters providing daily updates on testimony and evidence. Social media buzzed with commentary from people following the case, though the judge had issued strict orders about not allowing outside influences to affect the proceedings. The first week of testimony focused on establishing the timeline of events and introducing the evidence that connected both victims to Yust. Detective Collins took the stand to describe the investigation that had led from Jessica's disappearance to the discovery of both bodies. Her testimony was methodical and professional, walking the jury through the step-by-step process that had built the case against Yust. She described the initial missing person report, the discovery of Jessica's burned car, and the eventual finding of both bodies in the Cass County field. Witnesses from the September 2016 party testified about seeing Jessica leave with Yust, though some details remained fuzzy after nearly 5 years. Friends described Jessica's demeanor that night as happy and carefree, with no indication that she felt threatened or afraid. Former girlfriends of Yust took the stand to describe patterns of controlling and violent behavior that had characterized his relationships. Their testimony painted a picture of a man who became increasingly dangerous when women tried to leave him or assert their independence. The most emotional testimony came from Kara Kopetsky's friends, who described her fear of Yust in the months before her disappearance in 2007. Several witnesses recalled Kara's attempts to break off their relationship and Yust's refusal to accept her decision. Phone records and digital evidence were presented to show Yust's movements and communications during the relevant time period. While not conclusive on their own, these records supported the prosecution's timeline of events. Jessica's parents listened to each witness with careful attention, taking notes and occasionally wiping away tears as their daughter's final hours were reconstructed through testimony. The formal legal process felt both necessary and inadequate to address the magnitude of their loss. The prosecution also presented evidence about the location where both bodies were found. The remote field in Cass County was significant because Yust had connections to the area through family and friends, making it likely he would have known it was isolated enough for his purposes. The second week of trial brought forensic experts to the stand, including Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the medical examiner who had supervised the recovery of both bodies. Her testimony was technical but crucial to establishing how both women had died. Dr. Hendricks explained that while the condition of the remains limited her analysis, she could determine that both women had died violently. The positioning of the bones and evidence of trauma suggested neither death had been accidental or from natural causes. The forensic analysis of Jessica's burned car provided additional evidence for the prosecution's case. Experts testified about the accelerants used to ensure the fire would destroy evidence and the deliberate nature of the vehicle's destruction. DNA evidence, while limited due to the condition of the remains, still provided some connections between the victims and locations associated with Yust. The forensic team had worked carefully to extract whatever evidence was possible from materials that had been exposed to the elements for years. Photographs of the crime scenes were presented to the jury, including images of the burned car and the field where both bodies were discovered. These visual exhibits had a powerful impact on jurors, who could see the deliberate nature of the crimes and the effort made to conceal them. Expert testimony about the timeline of decomposition helped establish when both women had died. For Jessica, the evidence pointed to death shortly after her disappearance in September 2016. Kara's remains, found in the same general area, supported the conclusion that she had been killed in 2007. The prosecution also presented evidence about Yust's behavior in the periods following both disappearances. Witnesses described changes in his demeanor and suspicious activities that supported the theory he was involved in covering up the crimes. defense attorneys challenged much of the forensic evidence during cross-examination, arguing that the degraded condition of the remains made definitive conclusions impossible. They suggested that other suspects had not been adequately investigated and that the evidence against their client was circumstantial. Jessica's parents found the forensic testimony particularly difficult to hear, as it forced them to confront the violent reality of their daughter's death. The clinical language of forensic science could not diminish the horror of what Jessica had endured. The defense began presenting their case in the third week of trial, focusing on creating doubt about the prosecution's evidence and timeline. Defense attorney Michael Torres argued that, while both murders were tragic, the state had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Yust was responsible. Their strategy centered on challenging the reliability of witness testimony, particularly from people whose memories were being tested after many years. They pointed out inconsistencies in witness accounts and suggested that the passage of time had allowed speculation to become confused with actual memory. The defense also questioned the forensic evidence, arguing that the degraded condition of the remains made it impossible to determine exactly how either woman had died. They suggested that the medical examiner's conclusions were based on assumptions rather than definitive physical evidence. Several character witnesses testified on Yust's behalf, describing him as someone capable of kindness and normal relationships. These witnesses acknowledged his past problems but argued that he was not capable of the premeditated violence described by prosecutors. Yust's family members took the stand to provide alibi testimony for some of the relevant time periods. While their accounts were not complete, they offered alternative explanations for some of Yust's activities during the times when the prosecution alleged he was committing crimes. The defense strategy also included challenging the investigation itself, arguing that police had focused on Yust too early and had not adequately explored other possibilities. They suggested that tunnel vision had led investigators to ignore evidence that might have pointed toward other suspects. During cross-examination of prosecution witnesses, defense attorneys highlighted gaps in the evidence and inconsistencies in witness statements. They worked to create the impression that the case against their client was built on assumptions rather than solid proof. The families of both victims watched the defense presentation with frustration, feeling that the attorneys were trying to minimize the significance of evidence that seemed overwhelming to them. They had lived with this case for years and felt the connections were clear. Media coverage during the defense phase focused on the legal strategies being employed and the challenges of prosecuting cases that relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. Legal experts provided commentary about the strengths and weaknesses of both sides' arguments. The final week of trial brought closing arguments from both sides, with prosecutors and defense attorneys making their final appeals to the jury. The courtroom was packed with family members, media representatives, and community members who had followed the case for years. Prosecutor Sarah Chen delivered a powerful closing argument that wove together all the evidence presented during the trial. She reminded the jury of the pattern of violence in Yust's relationships and the connections between both victims and the defendant. Kara Kopetsky and Jessica Runions died because they encountered a man who could not accept rejection, Chen told the jury. The evidence shows a clear pattern of escalating violence that culminated in the murders of two innocent young women. She methodically reviewed the evidence witness testimony about both women's relationships with Yust, the forensic evidence from the crime scenes, and the deliberate efforts to conceal both crimes. The burned car and the remote burial location demonstrated consciousness of guilt. Defense attorney Torres countered with an argument focused on reasonable doubt. He acknowledged the tragedy of both deaths, but maintained that the prosecution had not proven their client's guilt beyond the legal standard required for conviction. This case is built on coincidence and speculation, Torres argued. While these crimes are horrible, convicting the wrong person does not serve justice or honor the memory of these victims. The defense closing highlighted the gaps in the evidence and the passage of time that had made definitive proof difficult. They argued that other suspects had not been adequately investigated and that rush to judgment had compromised the investigation. Both families listened intently to the closing arguments, knowing that the jury's decision would determine whether their years of seeking justice would result in accountability. The formal legal process was finally nearing its conclusion. The judge provided detailed instructions to the jury about the legal standards they must apply and the evidence they should consider. The complexity of the case and the serious nature of the charges meant that deliberations could take considerable time. As the jury retired to begin their deliberations, both families prepared for what they knew could be a long wait. The outcome would determine not just Yust's fate but their own sense of whether justice had been served. The jury deliberated for 2 days, reviewing evidence and testimony as they worked to reach unanimous verdicts on both murder charges. The deliberation room was filled with crime scene photographs, forensic reports, and transcripts of witness testimony. During the waiting period, both families remained at the courthouse, unable to concentrate on anything other than the pending verdicts. Jessica's parents held hands in the hallway, while Kara's mother paced nervously, having waited 14 years for this moment. Detective Collins also waited at the courthouse, reflecting on the investigation that had consumed nearly 5 years of her career. The case had tested her skills and dedication, but she felt confident that the evidence supported the charges against Yust. Media representatives filled the courthouse corridors, ready to broadcast the verdicts as soon as they were announced. The case had captured public attention throughout Kansas City and beyond, with many people feeling personally invested in the outcome. On April 15, 2021, the jury announced they had reached verdicts on both counts. The courtroom filled quickly as word spread that a decision had been made. Family members, reporters, and curious observers packed the available seats. Judge Atwell called the court to order as the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdicts. The silence in the courtroom was complete, with everyone focused on the words that would determine Yust's fate and provide closure for both families. On the charge of murder in the first degree and the death of Jessica Runions, we find the defendant guilty. The words seemed to echo in the quiet courtroom. Jessica's mother gasped and began crying, while her father wrapped his arms around her. 4.5 years after their daughter's disappearance, they finally had the answer they had sought. On the charge of murder in the first degree and the death of Kara Kopetsky, we find the defendant guilty. Kara's mother closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude. 14 years of uncertainty and advocacy had led to this moment of vindication. Her daughter's killer would finally be held accountable. Yust showed little emotion as the verdicts were read, though his attorneys appeared disappointed with the outcome. The defense had fought hard to create reasonable doubt, but the jury had found the evidence compelling. The sentencing hearing took place several weeks later, providing both families with an opportunity to address the court about the impact of their losses. Victim impact statements had become an important part of the legal process, allowing families to speak directly about how the crimes had affected their lives. Jessica's mother spoke first, her voice steady, despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her words. She described Jessica's dreams and aspirations, the family traditions that would never be the same, and the profound emptiness that had defined their lives since September 2016. Jessica was just beginning to discover who she was and what she wanted from life, she told the judge. Kylr Yust stole not just her life, but all the possibilities that should have been her future. Jessica's father spoke about the practical impacts of their loss, the birthday celebrations that would never happen, the graduations they would never attend, the grandchildren they would never know. His quiet dignity conveyed the depth of their family's grief. Kara's mother delivered a statement that reflected her 14 years of advocacy and searching. She described the limbo of not knowing what had happened to her daughter and the relief of finally having answers, even though those answers came with the confirmation of her worst fears. Kara was full of life and music and dreams, she said. She deserved to grow up and experience all the joys that life could offer. Instead, she became another statistic in the epidemic of violence against women. The prosecution requested the maximum sentence allowed under law, arguing that Yust's crimes demonstrated a pattern of violence that posed a continuing threat to society. They emphasized the premeditated nature of both murders and the efforts made to conceal the crimes. Defense attorneys asked for leniency, citing their client's background and arguing that life in prison without the possibility of parole would be sufficient punishment. They maintained that Yust was not beyond redemption and that the possibility of eventual rehabilitation should be preserved. Judge Atwell listened carefully to all the statements before announcing his decision. He sentenced Yust to life in prison plus 15 years, ensuring that he would never again be free to harm anyone. The sentence brought a sense of closure to both families, though nothing could fully heal the wounds that had been inflicted by their losses. In the weeks and months following Yust's conviction and sentencing, both families worked to process the complex emotions that came with finally achieving justice. The legal victory provided validation and closure, but it also marked the end of a chapter that had given structure and purpose to their grief. Jessica's parents found themselves needing to rebuild their lives around something other than the pursuit of justice. They had devoted nearly 5 years to keeping their daughter's case in the public eye and working with investigators. Now they faced the challenge of finding new meaning while honoring Jessica's memory. They established a foundation in Jessica's name, focused on supporting families of missing persons and advocating for improved investigation techniques. The foundation provided both emotional support and practical assistance to people navigating the complex systems involved in missing person cases. Kara's mother continued her advocacy work, using her 14 years of experience to help other families avoid some of the mistakes and frustrations she had encountered. Her expertise in dealing with law enforcement and media had made her a valuable resource for other grieving parents. The community response to the conviction was overwhelmingly positive, with many residents expressing relief that justice had finally been served. The case had created a sense of vulnerability that affected how parents supervised their children and how young women approached social situations. Memorial services for both women drew hundreds of participants, celebrating their lives while also acknowledging the broader issues raised by their murders. Speakers addressed the epidemic of violence against women and the importance of supporting survivors of domestic violence. Detective Collins received recognition for her persistent work on the case, but she emphasized that the conviction represented the efforts of many people over several years. The investigation had required coordination between multiple agencies and the dedication of numerous individuals. The media coverage gradually shifted to focus on the broader implications of the case rather than the day-to-day legal developments. Reporters examined issues of domestic violence prevention, missing person investigation techniques, and the support systems available to affected families. Jessica's room at home was finally transformed into a memorial space where family members could remember her without the painful reminders of interrupted life. Photographs, awards, and personal items were arranged in a way that celebrated her achievements rather than mourning her loss. As 2022 began, both families had settled into new routines that incorporated their advocacy work while allowing them to process their grief in healthier ways. The immediate crisis of seeking justice had been resolved, but the longer-term work of healing and prevention continued. Jessica's foundation grew to include partnerships with law enforcement agencies, providing training on family communication during missing person investigations. Their work helped improve the experience for other families facing similar situations. The annual memorial services for both women became important events in the Kansas City community, drawing participants from across the region. These gatherings served multiple purposes, honoring the victims' memories, supporting their families, and raising awareness about violence prevention. Kara's mother published a book about her 14-year journey seeking justice for her daughter. The memoir provided both a cathartic outlet for her experiences and a resource for other families dealing with similar losses. Proceeds from the book supported missing person advocacy organizations. The location where both bodies were discovered was marked with a small memorial, though the families chose to focus their public remembrance efforts on more positive settings. The field represented tragedy, while they preferred to celebrate their daughters' lives in places associated with joy and accomplishment. Law enforcement agencies used the case as a training example for investigators learning to handle complex missing person cases. The investigation demonstrated the importance of persistence, interagency cooperation, and maintaining relationships with victim families. Yust's appeals were predictably unsuccessful, with appellate courts finding no significant errors in the trial proceedings or the evidence presented. He remained incarcerated with no realistic possibility of release, providing both families with assurance that he could not harm anyone else. The media attention around the case contributed to broader conversations about domestic violence prevention and the warning signs that might help people identify potentially dangerous relationships. Educational programs incorporated elements of Jessica and Kara's stories as cautionary examples. Community support for both families remained strong, even as public attention moved to other cases and concerns. The neighborhood networks that had formed during the crisis continued to provide emotional and practical support for the ongoing healing process. By 2023, the work of both families had evolved into sustainable advocacy that honored their daughters while helping others facing similar tragedies. Jessica's foundation had assisted dozens of families, providing both emotional support and practical guidance for navigating missing person investigations. The foundation's work included lobbying for legislative changes that would improve law enforcement response to missing person cases. They advocated for mandatory training programs, improved coordination between agencies, and better support systems for affected families. Kara's mother had become a nationally recognized advocate for missing person families, speaking at conferences and consulting with law enforcement agencies about best practices for family communication. Her expertise was sought by agencies across the country. The community healing process continued through various memorial activities and prevention programs. Schools incorporated violence prevention education into their curricula, and local organizations provided support services for people in potentially dangerous relationships. Jessica and Kara's stories were featured in true crime documentaries and podcasts, helping to keep their memories alive while also educating audiences about the warning signs of violent relationships. The families carefully managed these media appearances to ensure respectful treatment of their daughters' stories. The annual memorial services had grown into significant community events that attracted participants from beyond Kansas City. These gatherings provided opportunities for education, remembrance, and fundraising for organizations that supported victim families and violence prevention. Both families had found ways to channel their grief into meaningful action that created positive change for others. While nothing could restore their daughters, their advocacy work provided a sense of purpose that helped with the ongoing healing process. The investigation techniques developed during the case were shared with other agencies dealing with similar crimes. The coordination between local, state, and federal investigators became a model for handling complex cases that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. Detective Collins had been promoted and now oversaw training programs that incorporated lessons learned from the Jessica and Kara case. Her experience demonstrated the importance of persistence and family cooperation in solving difficult cases. The courthouse where Yust was tried became a symbol of justice for both families, representing the culmination of years of effort to hold him accountable for his crimes. As 2024 arrived, both families reflected on the journey that had brought them from tragedy to advocacy. 7.5 years had passed since Jessica's disappearance, and 17 years since Kara vanished, but their daughter's impact continued to grow through the work being done in their names. Jessica's foundation had expanded to include a scholarship program for young women pursuing careers in criminal justice or victim advocacy. The scholarships honored Jessica's memory while supporting others who wanted to make a difference in fighting violence against women. The foundation also funded research into missing person investigation techniques, supporting academic studies that might lead to improved methods for finding missing people more quickly. This research represented hope that future families might be spared some of the uncertainty that both families had endured. Kara's mother's advocacy had contributed to legislative changes in several states, improving how law enforcement agencies handle missing person cases involving domestic violence. These changes represented tangible progress that could prevent other families from experiencing similar frustrations. The community in Kansas City had been permanently changed by the case, with many residents becoming more aware of domestic violence issues and more supportive of prevention programs. Local organizations reported increased volunteerism and donations following the publicity around Jessica and Kara's cases. Memorial gardens were established at both women's high schools, providing peaceful spaces for reflection and remembrance. These gardens served as living memorials that celebrated their lives rather than focusing on their death. The media coverage of the case had contributed to broader awareness about the challenges faced by families of missing persons. This awareness led to improved support systems and more comprehensive resources for people dealing with similar situations. Both families had found ways to honor their daughters while building meaningful lives around their advocacy work. The foundation and awareness activities provided structure and purpose that helped with the ongoing process of grief and healing. The legal system's handling of the case was studied by criminal justice researchers as an example of effective prosecution in complex murder cases. The coordination between agencies and the persistent investigation provided a model for handling similar crimes. The spring of 2025 marked nearly 9 years since Jessica's disappearance and 18 years since Kara vanished. Both families gathered for the annual memorial service, reflecting on how their daughters' legacies had grown and evolved over time. The memorial service drew the largest crowd yet, with hundreds of people coming together to remember both women and celebrate the positive changes that had occurred in their names. Speakers included family members, law enforcement officials, advocates, and scholarship recipients who had been supported by Jessica's foundation. Jessica's mother spoke about the unexpected ways that grief had led to purpose and community. She described how their family's worst tragedy had revealed the kindness and strength of their neighbors, friends, and even strangers who had supported their search for justice. "We never imagined that Jessica's story would touch so many lives," she said. "While we would give anything to have her back, we're grateful that her memory continues to make a difference for other families." Kara's mother reflected on the nearly 2 decades since her daughter's disappearance and the long journey to justice and advocacy that had followed. She emphasized the importance of never giving up hope and continuing to fight for answers even when the path seemed impossible. The memorial featured musical performances, including some of Kara's favorite songs performed by local artists. The combination of remembrance and celebration created an atmosphere that honored both women while looking forward to continued positive change. Scholarship recipients from Jessica's foundation shared their experiences and career goals, demonstrating how the foundation's work was creating new advocates and criminal justice professionals. Their presence at the memorial represented hope for continued progress in preventing violence against women. The sun set over the gathering as candles were lit in memory of both Jessica and Kara. The candlelight ceremony had become a traditional conclusion to the annual memorial, symbolizing how their lights continued to shine through the work being done in their honor. Family members, friends, advocates, and community members stood together in the gathering dusk, united by loss but strengthened by the knowledge that love endures longer than violence, and that even in darkness, the call for justice will never be silenced.